My name is Evelyn Callahan. I am 41 years old, and I am a lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps. But none of that mattered to the people sitting across from me in that courtroom. Not the medals pinned to my chest. Not the years I spent risking my life on foreign soil. Not the sacrifices, the ones no one ever talks about when you come home to silence instead of banners. To them, I was nothing. A failure. A lowly soldier they could mock, erase, and discard when I was no longer convenient. The people sitting on the other side of that courtroom weren't strangers. They were my family, my own parents, my younger brother Ryan. The same people who once called me daughter-sister now looked at me with thinly veiled disgust. They had come for everything: the house my grandfather left behind, the land, the legacy. And they sat there straight-backed in tailored suits, while their attorney painted me as unstable, absent, undeserving. She chose deployments over family. I heard my mother's voice, brittle and sharp, cut through the air like broken glass. She abandoned us, my father added coldly. She doesn't belong here anymore. I stayed silent. I let them speak. Because that's what they expected, the quiet girl, who never fought back, the soldier who took orders. They didn't know. I had been preparing for this moment longer than they could imagine. I watched their eyes when I reached into my briefcase. I felt the weight of the courtroom shift as I pulled out one single sheet of paper, neatly folded edges, worn from where my fingers had traced it 1,000 times in the dark. It wasn't thick. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple. But it was everything. I handed it to my attorney, who placed it silently on the judge's bench. And then it happened. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and tired eyes, read the name at the top of that document. She paused. Her breath caught. And then, without a word, she slowly pushed back her chair and stood. Silent, respectful. Her gaze met mine, not as adversaries, not as plaintiff and defendant, but as two soldiers who understood something most people never will. And before anyone else could speak, I heard the footsteps. 12 Marines in full-dress blues entered the back of the courtroom, their movements precise, deliberate, flawless. They stopped shoulder to shoulder, forming a silent line of respect. And then, they saluted. The room fell silent. The smirks vanished from my parents' faces. My brother's confident facade cracked. The lawyer who had called me a lowly soldier minutes earlier dropped her pen. No one moved. No one spoke. Because at that moment they all understood they had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken my kindness for surrender. And now, it was too late. I wish I could tell you I felt triumph, that I smiled, that I tasted revenge like something sweet on my tongue. But the truth is, all I felt was stillness, a deep, quiet ache where love used to be. I didn't fight this battle for money, not for land, not for inheritance. I fought because sometimes you have to remind the world who you are, even if it means standing alone, even if it means facing the people who should have loved you most. As I stood there, unmoving, unflinching, I thought back to the words my grandfather once whispered to me when I was just a child. Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who stands with you when the world turns cold. That day, I stood alone, but I also stood free. The judge's voice, when it finally returned, was soft but unwavering. Lieutenant Colonel Callahan, please be seated. The court recognizes your service. And as I lowered myself into my chair, the Marines behind me lowered their salutes in perfect unison. My parents didn't say a word. They couldn't. It was too late. And that was just the beginning. They say childhood shapes you. I wish I could say mine shaped me into something soft, something light. But that would be a lie. I grew up in a house where love was conditional, if it existed at all. I was the firstborn, the unwanted daughter, the disappointment my parents could never quite hide. My father, Robert Callahan, was a man of few words but many judgments. He carried the air of a man who believed the world owed him something and hated everyone who reminded him it didn't. My mother, Diane, was complicated. Beautiful once, I think. Sharp. Ambitious. But whatever dreams she'd held as a girl had been crushed early by family, by expectation, by the suffocating smallness of our town. I remember overhearing her once. When I was 7, she was drunk talking to a neighbor at a backyard barbecue. I wanted to join the military, you know. She slurred, laughing bitterly. Wanted to be something. But my father said that wasn't for girls, so I married instead. Settled down, had kids. The way she said had kids like it was some burden she'd never wanted. Like I was the weight around her neck. She never hit me. It was never that obvious. But the words she used, the silences. Those leave marks too. Sometimes deeper than fists. I was the child she barely looked at. The child she never bragged about. The child she punished with indifference. There was only one person in that house who ever made me feel seen. My grandfather, Harold Callahan. A Korean War veteran with hands like leather and eyes soft as winter sky. He was the only one who noticed when I got my first A in school. The only one who cheered from the sidelines at my awkward little soccer games. The only one who, when I was 12 and crying quietly in the corner after my mother accused me of showing off for winning the spelling bee, sat beside me without saying a word and just stayed. He wasn't a talkative man. War had taken that from him, I think. But when he spoke, he made it count. I still remember the night everything changed. I was 15. It was after another fight, this one, because I told my parents I wanted to apply for the ROTC program at school. My mother's face twisted in disgust. "You're not joining the military," she spat. "No daughter of mine is throwing her life away like that. You think they care about you. You think they'll ever see you as anything other than disposable." And my father, he just laughed. "Don't waste your time," he muttered. "You'll quit like you quit everything else." I ran to the porch, slid down against the cold wood, and buried my face in my knees. That's when I heard the soft creak of the old screen door, my grandfather. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't have to. He just sat down beside me, pulled a worn silver lighter from his pocket, flicked it once, an old habit from his soldiering days, and said, "Don't let small people tell you how big you can be." I looked up confused. He smiled, soft, tired. "They tried to stop me too," he said. "Told me I wasn't smart enough, strong enough, good enough. But I went anyway. I fought anyway. And I came home not because I was the best," he paused, lighting a cigarette, "but because I refused to let anyone else write my story. I didn't say anything. I just let the words soak into my bones. That night I made my decision. I would leave. I would join the Marines. I would become something more than the daughter they despised. I worked 2 jobs to pay for application fees. I ran 5 miles every morning before school. I studied harder than I ever had in my life. And on my 17th birthday, I signed the papers. Enlisted. No fanfare, no celebration. Just me, a recruiter with kind eyes, and the quiet promise to myself that I would never let anyone make me feel small again. Leaving home wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a slammed door or a screaming match. It was silence. A cold breakfast left untouched. A father who didn't even look up from his newspaper. A mother who, as I walked out the door with my one duffel bag, said flatly, "You'll be back. Girls like you always come back." But I never did. I wish I could tell you that the Marines welcomed me like a long-lost daughter. They didn't. The Corps breaks you, then rebuilds you. And for a girl like me, skinny, overlooked, carrying the weight of a lifetime of not being enough, it was hell. But I survived it. More than that, I excelled. I rose through the ranks not because I was the strongest, God knows I wasn't. Not because I was the smartest, though I was stubborn enough to learn fast. I rose because I refused to quit. Because every time I hit a wall, I heard my grandfather's voice in my head. "Don't let small people tell you how big you can be." I made it. Lieutenant Colonel, combat tours, decorations. I built a life I was proud of. But the one thing I never expected, the one thing I never saw coming, was that the people I left behind, the family I thought I'd finally outrun, would one day come for me all over again. Not with fists, not with words, but with something colder, sharper. Legal papers, lies, betrayal, and that is how this story really began. 15 years. That's how long it had been since I last stepped foot in my hometown. 15 years since I packed my life into one small bag and left without looking back. I told myself I would never return. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not even for goodbyes. But death has a way of calling you home, even when the home isn't really yours anymore. It was the news of my grandfather's passing that brought me back. A simple call from a lawyer, no emotion, no warmth. "Mr. Harold Callahan has passed. The service is this Saturday. You're listed as a relative. That was it. No message from my mother. No word from my father or brother. Just silence. The same kind of silence they had given me all my life. I drove 12 hours straight. Didn't stop except for gas. Didn't sleep. Didn't think about how I would be received. Somewhere deep down, I already knew. When I pulled into the town, the same cracked sidewalks, the same faded storefronts, nothing had changed. Except me. I parked 2 blocks from the church. There were already too many cars in the lot, too many familiar faces in dark clothing gathered on the steps. I could feel the stares before I even stepped out. I wore my dress blues, not to show off, not to make a statement, but because my grandfather Harold Callahan had always said that a uniform was a promise to serve, to protect, to stand for something, and he deserved to be honored, even if no one else in that place thought so. As I approached the church, my parents were the first to notice. My mother's eyes swept over me, slow and deliberate. She didn't smile, didn't wave, didn't move an inch. My father crossed his arms, his lips pressed into that same thin line I remembered from childhood, the one that meant disapproval, disgust. Ryan, my brother, looked up from his phone only briefly before whispering something to his wife. They laughed, at their sister, at the woman who had buried friends, worn the weight of command, held broken soldiers in her arms, and still somehow was never enough for them. No one spoke to me, not one person. I walked up the steps. I nodded politely. I kept my face calm. Inside, though, I could feel the old wounds splitting open. There was no seat for me. Every pew was filled. My family, the same family who had once sat around the dinner table with me, who had taken my grandfather's kindness and twisted it into entitlement, made no effort to make room. I stood at the back, in full uniform, alone. I watched as they carried his casket down the aisle. I stood straight, hands at my sides, heart pounding in the stillness. And as the service began, I realized something was off. There was no mention of me. Not in the pastor's words, not in the obituary, not even in the family acknowledgments. The man who had been the only warmth in my life, the only one who had ever called me brave, and I was erased. Like I never existed. The ache that filled my chest wasn't new, but it was sharper than I remembered. After the service, I approached the casket alone. My parents, my brother, their friends, they stayed huddled together, whispering. No one followed me. No one interrupted. I laid my hand on the polished wood, took a breath. Thank you, I whispered, for seeing me, for believing in me when no one else did. I felt the tears sting, but I blinked them back. I wouldn't let them see me cry. Not here, not now. As I turned to leave, I heard fragments of conversation. A cousin, one I barely remembered, mentioning something about the house, about the will, about how, of course, Diane and Robert are inheriting everything, how it was the right thing, how Evelyn was never really part of the family anyway. I kept walking, didn't stop, didn't react, but the words clung to me, sticky, rotten. Back at my motel, I couldn't sleep. The memories kept circling. The way my mother's eyes narrowed when she saw me. The way my father didn't even shake my hand. The empty seat that should have been mine. Something was wrong. Something wasn't adding up. My grandfather wasn't a wealthy man, but he was meticulous, detail-oriented. A man who once told me, "Will isn't about money, it's about making sure your voice still speaks after you're gone." And this didn't feel like his voice. I pulled out my phone, typed in the name of the attorney who had called me. It took less than an hour to confirm the first oddity. The reading of the will had already happened. Without me, without even notifying me. I sat there in the dark motel room, the hum of the old air conditioner filling the silence, and I felt it. That same cold weight I'd carried on battlefields. The same gut instinct that had saved my life more times than I could count. Something was very, very wrong. And whatever it was, I was going to find it. Not for revenge, not for money, but because Harold Callahan raised me better than to walk away from the truth. I had come home for a funeral, but I was about to uncover something far bigger, something my family thought they had buried for good. And this time, I wasn't leaving until justice was served. There's a moment right before a battle begins when every instinct sharpens. The air stills, time slows, And you know without question that something is coming. That's what it felt like the morning after the funeral. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, not just emotionally, not just the cold way my family had treated me, but something deeper, something deliberate. I wasn't supposed to be there. That much was clear. And the more I replayed the events in my mind, the missing seat at the church, the sidelong glances, the hushed voices, the more I felt the weight of something hidden pressing against me. I did what I was trained to do. I went to work. I started with the basics: public records, county filings, property deeds. It wasn't difficult. Years in military intelligence teaches you how to find patterns, how to follow trails most people overlook. The first red flag was immediate. The will that had supposedly been read last month, the one that left everything to my parents and my brother, was filed just 3 weeks before my grandfather's death. Too recent, too convenient. I knew my grandfather. He was the kind of man who kept his affairs in order. He wouldn't have waited until the last minute to change his wishes. I dug deeper. I requested a copy of the document under the state's public records law. It arrived by email that afternoon, a scanned PDF. At first glance, it looked legitimate. Legal letterhead, typed neatly, signed, dated. But something caught my eye. The signature. It wasn't right. Too stiff, too clean. My grandfather's real signature. I had dozens of samples in old birthday cards. Letters, even a pocket knife he had engraved for me as a child, was more fluid, more natural. I enlarged the signature on my laptop screen and stared at it until the pieces clicked. It was a forgery, a good one, but a forgery all the same. I kept going. The lawyer listed as having drafted the will, Anthony Carlisle, didn't exist. No bar number, no law office, just a name, fake. It wasn't just sloppy, it was insulting. They hadn't even tried that hard, because they hadn't thought I'd ever come back, hadn't thought I'd ever question it. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. Not from shock, but from the icy calm that settled over me when something shifts from suspicion to certainty. They had stolen his legacy, and they were about to steal mine. I knew who was behind it before I made the calls. It wasn't hard to guess. Ryan, my younger brother, the golden boy, the one who could never quite seem to hold a job, who had always relied on charm and other people's money to skate by. I started with his financials, public liens, bankruptcy filings, court records. It was worse than I imagined. 3 failed businesses, 2 lawsuits, a defaulted mortgage, credit card debt in the 6 figures. And then there was the house, my grandfather's house, the one he had built with his own hands, the one that until the funeral I had believed would be preserved or passed on with respect. But according to county filings, that house was already in the process of being transferred to Ryan's name. The paperwork had been filed the day after my grandfather's death. It wasn't grief, it wasn't love, it was greed. And my parents, they weren't innocent bystanders. I pulled their records: 2 property holdings, tax filings, social club memberships. My father's job at the hardware store didn't explain the luxury SUV parked in the driveway. My mother's community fundraising didn't cover the designer handbags and country club fees. They were in on it, all of them, together. The more I pieced it together, the clearer it became. They had forged the will, they had manipulated the legal system, and they had erased me completely because they thought I was too far away, too busy, too broken to fight back. But they were wrong. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Confrontation is the last step. First you gather, you watch, you build the case. I went to the house that night, the old house, my grandfather's house. I parked down the street lights off and just sat there watching. The porch light was on. Laughter drifted from the living room. Ryan's car in the driveway. My father's truck. My mother's laughter, sharp, brittle, familiar. I thought about the nights I'd spent on that porch as a child. How my grandfather used to sit with me in the dark, pointing out the stars. How he taught me to tie knots, to read maps, to trust my instincts. How he'd told me once, after I came home crying from school, sometimes the people who are supposed to love you are the ones who teach you how to survive without them. I stayed there for over an hour. Then I left. I didn't knock, didn't announce myself, didn't let them know I was on to them. The next morning, I called a lawyer, one who specialized in probate fraud. I started the process of quietly gathering every piece of evidence I could: financial transfers, signature analysis, witness statements, And I kept my mouth shut. I smiled when they called me the forgotten daughter. I nodded politely when my mother made passive-aggressive digs about career women and failed family values. I pretended I didn't know, because sometimes silence is more powerful than any scream. I wasn't going to fight them in the gutter. I wasn't going to stoop to their level, but I was going to take back what was mine, with precision, with dignity, and with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the truth once revealed has a weight no lie can outrun. They had mocked me as a lowly soldier, but they had forgotten something essential. I had spent my life learning how to survive impossible odds. And I wasn't going to lose now, not this time. The worst kind of pain isn't physical. It isn't the sharp sting of shrapnel or the searing heat of a battlefield wound. It's the quiet kind, the kind that seeps into your bones when the people you love look right through you as if you were never really there to begin with. I've faced death. I've faced chaos. I've stood in the middle of gunfire so thick it drowned out thought. But nothing has ever felt as brutal as the silence that met me each time I came home. When you're deployed, you build your world in fragments, moments, little windows of time stolen between missions, and you hold on to whatever connection you can. Letters, photos, the sound of a familiar voice across a shaky phone line. But for me, those phone lines were always quiet. I remember the first time I came home on leave. It had been 9 months without seeing my family. I was 23, just promoted. I still carried the naive hope that maybe, just maybe, they would be proud. I stepped off that bus in my dress blues, my boots polished, medals gleaming, and no one was there, not my parents, not my brother. No welcome sign, no smiles, just the cold slap of winter wind and the realization that I had come home to no one. I made my way to the house, knocked. My mother opened the door with a surprised expression as if I was an unexpected guest, not her daughter returning from the other side of the world. "Oh," she said flatly. "Didn't know you were coming." No hug, no warmth, just those words. I stayed 2 days, a mistake I wouldn't repeat often. Most of the time, they barely spoke to me. Ryan had his friends over, laughing, drinking, filling the house with noise I wasn't part of. My father barely glanced up from the television. My mother smiled politely when I spoke, but her eyes, those eyes, never softened. I left early, took the earliest bus back to base, and when I texted to say I'd made it safely, no reply. I learned quickly. Don't expect answers, don't expect calls, don't expect them to care. The military became my home, the battlefield my family. But no matter how hard you train, no matter how many medals they pin on your chest, some wounds don't heal, some silences stay with you. I can still remember the faces of the young Marines I held in my arms as they bled out, the ones who didn't make it home, the ones whose mothers would have given anything to have them walk through the door again. And yet, I came home, and it was like I never existed. One night during a deployment in Helmand Province, I sat beneath a fractured moon, dust in the air, the sound of distant gunfire rolling across the desert. And I thought I would rather die here surrounded by brothers and sisters who would die for me than live one more day in a house where I'm invisible. That thought stayed with me, long after the fighting stopped, long after the medals were polished and the uniforms hung up. Because some battles, some of the deepest, darkest battles, don't happen in the field. They happen in the quiet, in the places you're supposed to feel safest. I thought I had buried those feelings, thought I had hardened myself enough. But coming back from my grandfather's funeral, seeing them again, it all came back like shrapnel under the skin. And then I found the letter. It was by accident, buried beneath old photographs in the attic of the house he left behind. A small envelope yellowed with time. My name written in shaky but familiar handwriting, Evelyn. I sat down right there on the dusty floor. My hands trembled as I opened it. And as I read the words, something inside me broke, and something else, something steady, was born in its place. "Kiddo," the letter began. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, I need you to know one thing. I see you. I have always seen you." I stopped, breathed, and kept reading. "I know what it feels like to be the outsider. I know what it means to carry the weight of a family that doesn't understand you. But I also know this: you are stronger than all of them combined. Not because of medals or ranks, but because you have a heart that still chooses to serve even when you've been discarded. I felt tears prick my eyes. I hadn't cried in years, not since my first deployment, not since I learned that tears don't stop bullets. But there in that attic, I let them fall. The letter continued, "I'm proud of you. I may not have said it enough, but I am. You are the best of this family, Evelyn. And when the time comes, because I believe it will, you will stand taller than they ever imagined. Because you carry something they don't, integrity. Never let them take that from you." The signature at the bottom was shaky but real. Harold Callahan, my grandfather, the only person who had ever truly loved me without condition. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it inside my jacket, and sat there for a long time, long after the attic grew dark, long after the weight of that house pressed in around me. Because in that moment I understood. This wasn't just about property. It wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about refusing to be erased. And I swore to myself right then, right there, that I would see this through. Not for the money, not for revenge, but for the girl I used to be, the one who kept waiting for her family to see her. And for the soldier I had become, the one who had learned to stand alone. The next morning, I made a decision that changed everything. I reached out to General Linda Brooks. Some people believe the military is cold, rigid, a place where rank and protocol matter more than people. But there are exceptions. General Brooks was one of them. The kind of leader who remembered names, who noticed the quiet ones in the back of the room, who understood that wars weren't always fought on foreign soil. She had been my commanding officer years ago, when I was still wet behind the ears, still trying to find my place in a system that didn't seem to have room for women who didn't fit the mold. She had seen something in me back then, something I hadn't even seen in myself. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 5 years. But some instincts don't fade. I typed her name into my secure phone, hands trembling slightly. It felt absurd, ridiculous. Who was I to ask for her help with something so personal, so messy? And yet, I pressed send. "Ma'am, I hope this isn't out of line. I need your advice. Family matter. Possible legal implications. Possible fraud. I trust no one else." Evelyn Callahan. I expected nothing. I expected silence. Instead, less than 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Callahan, come see me, tomorrow. Row 900. My office. Brooks." That was it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the old kitchen table of the house I'd inherited, at least on paper, staring at faded photographs of people who no longer felt like family. The letter from my grandfather lay folded on the table beside me. I traced the edges with my fingertips, reading his words over and over until they were etched into my bones. I thought about everything they'd taken. The lies, the manipulation, the erasure. And I thought about what I was about to do. The next morning, I pulled on my dress uniform. It still fit. The medals still shined. The insignia still carried weight. I looked at myself in the mirror, not the girl who had once stood on this porch, waiting to be seen, but the woman who had learned to stand without applause, without approval. I drove 2 hours to the base, where General Brooks had her office. Her aide greeted me with a quiet nod, leading me down polished hallways lined with framed commendations and photographs of battles both won and lost. When I stepped into her office, she was already standing, tall, composed. Her silver hair pulled into the same sharp bun I remembered. But her eyes were soft. "Evelyn," she said, using my first name. "Sit down." I did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She studied me the way she always had, not looking at my uniform, but at me. "The woman beneath the medals. Tell me," she said simply. So I did. I told her everything. The forged will, the cold reception, the subtle but deliberate erasure, my brother's debts, my parents' fear of scandal, the way they had tried to make me small, to make me disappear from my own history. And I told her about the letter, about my grandfather, about the only man who had ever believed I was more than the labels they threw at me. When I finished, my throat felt raw. General Brooks sat back, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But then she spoke. "They're underestimating you," she said softly. "That's their first mistake." I blinked. "They see the uniform," she continued, "but they don't see the woman inside it. They think you're just a soldier. They don't know you're a strategist." Her words hit something deep inside me. I don't know where to start, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded once. We start with the facts. Emotion doesn't win battles. Evidence does. She leaned forward, pulling a legal pad toward her. We're going to map this out. Every name, every transaction, every inconsistency. We treat this the same way we'd treat an intelligence breach. Something in me steadied. The soldier in me took over. This wasn't about hurt feelings. This was about facts, proof, strategy. For the next 3 hours, we worked. She asked questions pointed, precise. I answered. I showed her the forged signatures, the discrepancies in dates, the sudden changes in my family's financial behavior. When I faltered, she reminded me, one step at a time. You faced worse than this. By the time we finished, there was a rough blueprint, a timeline of deceit, a web of lies, a map of betrayal. I sat back, exhaling. For the first time in weeks, my breathing felt steady. She looked at me with something almost maternal. Evelyn, she said quietly, I've watched you lead men and women into situations most people can't imagine. You've saved lives, made hard calls. This is just another battlefield. And you're not alone. I felt something tighten in my chest. Something old, something fragile. Why are you helping me? I asked softly. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Because once, I was you, she whispered. And no one helped me. The room fell silent. The weight of her words settled deep into my bones. I stood. She did too. Thank you, I said. The words felt small, but they were all I had. She reached out, squeezing my shoulder gently. We'll get them, she said simply. One step at a time. As I left her office, the sun broke through the clouds. I stepped outside into the cold air, the wind catching the edges of my uniform. And for the first time in weeks, I felt steady on my feet. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the woman I had become. And I wasn't fighting alone. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and sharp. I stood in front of the mirror, fastening the last silver button on my dress blues. My fingers moved with practiced precision, muscle memory from years of service. The metals on my chest caught the soft light filtering through the window. Small pieces of metal that to most people meant nothing. To me, they were fragments of battles survived, sacrifices made. And yet, standing there, I didn't feel like a decorated Marine. I felt like a woman walking willingly into a battlefield far more ruthless than any I'd faced overseas, the family courtroom. I arrived alone, no fanfare, no applause, no one waiting by the courthouse steps. Just me, my uniform, and the quiet resolve I had spent years building. Inside, the room was already half full. I saw them immediately, my parents seated together, wearing the kind of stiff, practiced smiles that come from years of social pretense. My brother Ryan sat at their side, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Across from them, their lawyer's sharp suit. Sharper eyes sorted through papers. They didn't look at me when I entered. Or maybe they did, but I didn't meet their eyes. I kept my chin high, my steps measured. Each click of my polished shoes against the floor sounded impossibly loud in the silence of that room. I took my seat beside Franklin, General Brooks' trusted attorney. He gave me a small nod, calm and steady. I returned it, my face unreadable. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Holloway, entered moments later, and the room stood as one. When we sat again, I caught for just a moment the flicker of an expression on my mother's face. A smirk, a thin, bitter line of amusement. Your Honor, their lawyer began smoothly. We are here today to address the matter of the estate of the late Mr. Walter Callahan. My heart tightened slightly at the sound of my grandfather's name, but I said nothing. I sat, I listened, I waited. Their case unfolded the way I expected it would. They painted me as the estranged daughter, the one who left, the one who abandoned her family for a military career that, in their words, alienated her from the values and traditions of the Callahan family. I kept my eyes forward. I let them speak. They brought up my deployments as if they were character flaws. They spoke of my absence during birthdays, holidays, never once mentioning that I had sent gift cards, calls that were met with silence. They questioned my stability, my fitness to inherit anything that carried the Callahan name. And then, like clockwork, came the mockery. She's always wanted to wear that uniform to feel important, my mother said under her breath, but loud enough for the room to hear. Ryan gave a low laugh, barely contained. Even the lawyer smirked. The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I stayed still, I didn't flinch. Not because I didn't feel the sting, but because I had learned long ago, power is found in stillness. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly. The courtroom felt impossibly small, every eye on me, the air heavy with judgment. I spoke clearly, steadily, without anger. My name is Evelyn Callahan. I am 41 years old. I have served this country for over 2 decades as an officer in the United States Marine Corps. I am not here today to defend my service. I am here to speak the truth. My voice didn't waver. I explained step by step how I returned from my grandfather's funeral, only to discover that a new will had surfaced, one I had never seen. I detailed the discrepancies in signatures, the inconsistencies in dates. I shared without embellishment how I had been shut out, how no one informed me of the funeral arrangements, how no chair had been left for me at the service. I kept my voice even, my words precise. I didn't cry, I didn't accuse, I presented facts. At one point, my father scoffed audibly. "She's always been dramatic," he muttered. The judge shot him a warning look, but I didn't react. Because I knew this wasn't the moment for anger. This was the moment to let the truth settle, like quiet thunder. I continued. I explained how through legal channels I had begun to investigate. How records of financial transfers and sudden spending had surfaced. How the forged will had benefited only one party, Ryan, and how that alone raised legal and ethical concerns. Franklin, to his credit, kept his interventions minimal. He knew I didn't need saving. I could tell the judge was listening, really listening. Her eyes tracked every word, every movement. But my family, they weren't listening. They were smirking, rolling their eyes, whispering to each other as if the outcome was already written. I felt the weight of the uniform on my shoulders, not as armor, but as memory, as proof. Every deployment, every sleepless night, every sacrifice. They had brought me here, and still they mocked. The final blow came when my mother leaned slightly toward their lawyer, her voice carrying. "She's just a soldier," she said. "What does she know about family, about legacy?" I didn't move. But inside something clicked into place. Because in that moment I realized it wasn't just greed that drove them. It was contempt. A deep-seated belief that no matter what I had done, no matter what I had become, I would never be enough for them. I had never been enough. Not at 7, not at 17, not even now, but this time I wasn't here for their approval. I was here for the truth. When I returned to my seat, Franklin gave me the smallest nod. "You did well," he murmured. But I barely heard him, because I knew. The real storm was still ahead. I sat back down, my hands resting calmly on my lap, but inside my heart was steady like a drumline before a decisive battle. Franklin gave me a small nod, the kind that didn't need words. I could feel the weight of the courtroom pressing down on me, but I held my breath because I knew what came next would change everything. "Your Honor," Franklin said, rising smoothly, his voice composed. "With your permission, we would like to submit 2 critical pieces of evidence for the court's consideration." The judge, her expression unreadable, tilted her head slightly. "Proceed." Franklin gestured to me, and I stood pulling from my case the 2 documents that had burned holes in my hands for weeks. My grandfather's original will and the last letter he ever wrote to me, the one hidden deep inside a hollowed-out copy of a farewell to arms. The one only I was meant to find. I handed them to the bailiff. The room shifted. I could feel it in the air. The judge, Patricia Holloway, adjusted her glasses and began to read. The courtroom was so silent I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and relentless. My family shifted uncomfortably at the table across from me. My mother's lips pursed, her fingers clenching the armrest. Ryan's knee bounced nervously under the table. My father whispered something to their attorney, whose expression began to falter. Because they knew, I had the truth. The judge read in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then she carefully set the papers down and removed her glasses, her eyes flickering across the room before settling on me. "Ms. Callahan," she said softly, "would you mind approaching the bench?" I rose, without hesitation. Franklin followed. As we stepped forward, the judge's voice dropped to something nearly reverent. "This letter," she murmured, almost more to herself than to us. "This is the kind of testament that speaks louder than any legal argument." She glanced down at the signature, the familiar looping handwriting of my grandfather. And then, something happened I didn't expect. She stood. It was not a formal motion. not a requirement of law. It was something else, something deeper. She stood as if to honor something long forgotten. Her eyes softening flickered to my uniform. "You served," she said quietly, though it wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," I answered, my voice steady. "Marine Corps. 23 years." She nodded once, slowly. And then something shifted on her face, something profound. "I did too," she whispered. "Desert Storm." For a moment the courtroom wasn't a courtroom. It was two veterans meeting across time, across different wars, different battles, but with one shared code: honor. She straightened. "Thank you for your service, Colonel." Her words, Colonel, hung in the air. I didn't correct her, because she knew. And then, the impossible happened. The Judge Patricia Holloway turned to the room and said, her voice ringing clear. "Out of respect, I ask all present service members to rise." The Marines standing at the back of the room, men and women I didn't even know, stood in unison. Their boots echoed on the wooden floor as they rose to attention. Hands moved to foreheads in crisp salutes. I felt the breath catch in my throat. My parents silent, my brother motionless, the lawyer speechless. The room stood still. The weight of the moment sank deep into every corner. No one laughed. No one smirked. Because it was too late. Too late for their lies. Too late for their mockery. Too late for their carefully spun illusions. The truth had arrived. And with it, the quiet kind of justice that doesn't shout, doesn't gloat. It simply stands. The judge lowered her eyes to the documents once more. "This original will, written in Mr. Walter Callahan's own hand, supersedes any subsequent documents submitted to this court. Furthermore," she continued, her voice now edged with steel, "the letter accompanying this will clearly indicates his intentions to leave his estate to Miss Callahan, whom he described as the only one worthy of carrying forward the name." I swallowed hard. I hadn't known he'd written that. Across the room, my mother's face drained of color. My father leaned heavily against the table. Ryan's hands shook. The judge sat back down, but the atmosphere never returned to normal. The shift was permanent. Franklin cleared his throat. "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, we respectfully request dismissal of all claims filed by the opposing party and immediate recognition of the original testamentary documents." The judge nodded. "I concur. This court recognizes the validity of the original will and grants sole inheritance to Ms. Evelyn Callahan. Furthermore," she added, her voice turning cold, "given the evidence of potential fraud, the court will be forwarding this matter for criminal review." I exhaled softly. Not in triumph, there was no triumph here. Only truth, and the price of it. The gavel came down, once, sharp, final. The courtroom began to stir, but I stayed still. My parents still frozen. Ryan head bowed, hands over his face. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel revenge. What I felt was release. I gathered my papers quietly. Franklin whispered, "Well done," but I barely heard him. As I turned to leave, the Marines, who had stood still, held their posture. I gave them the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement between soldiers, and they returned it, crisp and solemn. Outside, the cold air hit my face, and I breathed. For the first time in years, I could breathe. The fight wasn't over. Not really. There would be fallout. There would be headlines, lawyers, maybe even criminal proceedings. But that moment, that singular moment, was mine. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't broken. I stood taller as I walked away, and I knew no matter what came next, I would face it. Unbroken, unbowed, free. The headlines came faster than I could process. Local newspapers, online forums, even the evening news, each headline more brutal than the last. Decorated Marine wins court battle against family fraud. Prominent Callahan family accused of will tampering. The truth, once buried so carefully, had clawed its way into the light. I watched it unfold, not with glee, not with triumph, but with a kind of quiet detachment, like standing on the shore while the tide pulled away everything that had once seemed so permanent. I didn't speak to my parents. I didn't need to. The community spoke for me. Within days, my family's social circle, once so carefully curated, began to collapse. The whispers followed them into every room, every grocery aisle, every church pew. Their faces, once symbols of respectability, now marked by something they could never scrub away: shame. Ryan lost his job first. The financial firm he worked for issued a short, polite statement about integrity and community values. His name was never mentioned, but we all knew. My mother's volunteer positions vanished one by one. The same women she had once lorded over at charity events now avoided her gaze. Invitations stopped arriving. Doors stopped opening. My father, stoic, proud, always composed, began walking with a slouch, as if the weight of it all had finally crushed something deep inside his bones. I didn't smile when I heard. I didn't celebrate. I simply sat with it. Grief in its own way was the loudest sound in the room, because for all the harm they had done, for all the lies and betrayals, they were still my family. The faces I had known since childhood. The voices that had once tucked me into bed. And yet, the people I had returned to were not the same as the people I remembered. The courtroom hadn't destroyed us. We had destroyed ourselves long before the gavel came down. In the weeks that followed, people in town treated me differently. Some with warmth, some with pity, others with cautious admiration. But I didn't need their approval. I wasn't seeking applause. I had fought not to win their favor, but to reclaim something far simpler, the right to stand in my own skin without apology. I moved back into the house my grandfather had left me. It needed repairs, needed life breathed back into it. But I found comfort in the peeling paint and the uneven floorboards. It was mine. No more than that, it was his. And through it, in some way, he was still with me. One afternoon, as I was sanding down an old banister, I heard footsteps. When I turned, I saw her. My mother. She stood on the front porch, thin-drawn, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind carried the scent of autumn leaves between us. She began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to. She trailed off, looking down at her hands, as if searching for words she no longer owned. I didn't speak. I didn't invite her in. I waited. Finally, she exhaled sharply and shook her head. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said softly. I don't know if I forgive myself. I nodded once. A small gesture. She turned, stepping back down the porch steps, and I let her go. Not out of cruelty, but because I knew some chasms can't be bridged. Not now, maybe not ever. And that was okay. The weeks melted into months. The scandal faded from the front page, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher gossip. People moved on, as they always do. But I didn't return to who I was before. I spent my days restoring the house room by room. A window here, a creaky stair there. Each nail, each brushstroke was an act of quiet defiance, of survival. At night, I would sit on the back porch with a cup of tea, the old letter from my grandfather tucked safely in my jacket pocket. Sometimes I read it. Sometimes I just held it, letting the weight of the paper remind me that the past, while painful, was not the whole of me. I thought often about justice, about what it really means, because justice doesn't always look like a courtroom victory. It doesn't always come with applause or headlines. Sometimes justice is quieter. Sometimes it is the simple act of refusing to be erased. I didn't hate my family, not anymore. Pity maybe, sadness certainly. But hate, no. I had left that on the courtroom floor. What they had done had cost them everything they once held dear. The community, the respect, the illusion of perfection. And it had cost me 2 years I could never reclaim. Wounds that would never fully close. But it had also given me something no amount of betrayal could take away. Myself, the real me. The woman who stood her ground. Who faced the storm and did not flinch. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard the distant sound of children's laughter from down the street. Life has always moved on. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. A real smile. Not born from victory, not born from revenge, but from peace. Because at last, I was free. And that, after everything, was enough. I didn't know what legacy meant until I had nothing left to prove. The court was over. The family I once tried so desperately to belong to had faded into the background of my life, still there, like old scars, but no longer dictating my every move. And for the first time in years, I could breathe. The inheritance from my grandfather was more than I expected. The house, of course, but also savings he'd carefully tucked away over decades. Investments I never knew about. A quiet man who had never bragged, never boasted, but who had built something solid, steady, waiting for the right hands to hold it. I thought long and hard about what to do with it. It would have been easy to spend it on myself. A new house, a new car, a fresh start somewhere far away. But that wasn't who he raised me to be. Instead, I used a portion of the money to set up something I wished had existed when I was a child. The Callahan Foundation, a scholarship fund for children of military families. It wasn't flashy, it didn't make headlines, but it was real. And for the first time, I felt like I was building something bigger than myself, something that would last. I named the first scholarship after him, the Harold Callahan Award for Resilience. Each time I signed the letters to recipients, I felt something lift inside me, a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying. The letters were always the same. You are stronger than you think. You are seen. You are valued. Keep going. And I meant every word. Some days I would sit on the porch of the old house, watching the wind move through the trees, thinking about how life can take everything from you and still give you something back. It was around this time that the first letter came. From her, from my mother. It arrived in a plain envelope, careful handwriting on the front. No return address, but I knew. I let it sit on my desk for 3 days before opening it. The letter was short, stilted, but it was the first thing she'd written to me in decades. Evelyn, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if I have the right to ask, but I wanted you to know I see now what I couldn't see then. I spent my life wanting to be the woman you became, and when I couldn't be her, I punished you for it. I read the words twice, 3 times, and then I cried. Not out of anger, not out of grief, but because sometimes broken things don't need to be fixed. Sometimes they just need to be acknowledged. We exchanged letters after that, slowly, carefully, never forced. I didn't forgive her right away. I'm not sure I ever truly did. But I let the letters continue. In them she admitted things I never thought I'd hear. That she had once dreamed of joining the Navy. That her parents, my grandparents, had crushed that dream before it could take shape. That she had spent her life trapped between who she was and who she was allowed to be. And when I did what she couldn't when I broke free, she couldn't bear it. Jealousy is a cruel thing. But fear is worse. Her words didn't erase the past. They didn't change what she'd done, but they helped me understand. And sometimes understanding is the first step toward peace. I kept busy with the foundation. We expanded the scholarship to cover not just tuition, but also counseling services, mentorship programs, and emergency grants for military families in crisis. It became more than a project. It became a purpose. I found that purpose changed me. I no longer looked in the mirror and saw the unwanted daughter. I no longer measured my worth by the acceptance of people who had never truly seen me. I saw strength. And I saw choice. I even started speaking at local events, something I never thought I'd do. I told my story, not the scandal, not the headlines, but the real story of a girl who grew up unseen, who built a life no one expected, who was broken and still stood back up. I spoke not for sympathy, but for solidarity. Because there are more of us than people realize. People who carry invisible wounds. People who have been told they are too much or not enough. People who have been made to feel small in their own families, in their own skins. To them I said this: you are not what was done to you. You are what you choose next. The letters from my mother slowed, then stopped. I learned through a neighbor that she had fallen ill. Cancer, stage 4. I didn't go to the hospital. I couldn't. Some lines, even when blurred, stay drawn. But I wrote her one last time. I hope you find peace, I wrote simply. I have. She passed quietly 2 months later. Her funeral was small, no headlines, no public drama. I didn't wear my uniform. I didn't need to. I stood at the back, hands folded, and whispered a quiet goodbye to the woman who had given me life, and the woman who had taken so much of it away. I let the wind carry the rest. In the years that followed, the Callahan Foundation grew. So did I. I found love again, not the desperate kind, not the kind that seeks to fill old wounds, but the gentle kind, the steady kind. I learned that family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up when you fall, the people who see you not as broken, but as whole. I learned that legacy isn't about wealth or fame. It's about the lives you touch, the stories you leave behind. And I learned most of all that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is patient. Sometimes it is simply choosing to rise. And in the end, I chose to rise. Forgiveness is a strange thing. People talk about it like it's a switch you can flip. One day you're angry, the next you're at peace. But I learned it doesn't work that way, at least not for me. The last letter from my mother arrived just weeks before she passed. Her handwriting was shaky, almost unreadable in places, but the words were clear. She wrote, "Evelyn, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that now. I spent my life resenting you for chasing the freedom I was too afraid to claim. I punished you for being brave when I wasn't. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry." I read those words in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat with the letter folded in my lap, breathing slow, steady breaths. And for the first time, I felt the weight of something I'd carried for decades begin to shift. Her apology came too late to fix anything, too late to rebuild what had been broken between us. But I realized it wasn't really for her. It was for me. It gave me permission to stop running. I wrote her back. Just one line. "I accept your apology. I wish you peace." I never heard from her again. When she died, I didn't speak at her funeral. I didn't stand by the casket. But I stood near the old church steps just as I had all those years before, when they tried to lock me out of my own grandfather's farewell. Only this time, there was no bitterness in me, only quiet. I learned that sometimes forgiveness isn't about the other person at all. Sometimes it's about setting yourself free from the need to keep bleeding. I let go. But I didn't forget. Some things you don't forget. My brother Ryan followed a different path. After the court case, after the truth came out, and the community turned its back on my family, I thought he might change. For a while, he seemed to. He kept a low profile, moved to another state, started what I thought was a legitimate business. But patterns are hard to break when they've been your survival for too long. 2 years after our mother passed, I got the call. Ryan had been arrested, charged with multiple counts of financial fraud and embezzlement. He'd conned dozens of people out of their savings, built an empire on lies. All of it crashing down just like the house of cards he'd built once before. This time, though, I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction. Just nothing. I didn't attend the trial. I didn't write to him in prison. I didn't need to. Justice, I realized, has its own rhythm. It doesn't always come when you want it, but eventually, it comes. And when it does, you don't have to lift a finger to make it happen. The truth has a way of surfacing all on its own. Some friends asked me if I felt vindicated, if I wanted to press further to make sure he paid the maximum price. I told them no. I had spent too many years trapped in that cycle: revenge, resentment, righteousness. I had learned sometimes the hardest way that holding on to anger only keeps you chained to the very people who tried to break you. Ryan would answer for what he did. The law would see to that. But I wasn't going to waste another breath on him. Instead, I poured myself into what mattered. The Callahan Foundation flourished. More scholarships, more lives changed. More stories of young men and women who would never have to feel invisible the way I once did. I found joy in quiet things: morning walks, letters from scholarship recipients, phone calls from fellow veterans who found strength in my story. I found love, not the kind that sweeps you off your feet, but the kind that steadies you. Laura, my wife, brought a peace into my life I hadn't known was possible. She didn't flinch at my past. She didn't pity me. She saw me, all of me, and I let her. I still think about my mother sometimes, about Ryan, about the version of me that once stood outside a locked church, too broken to speak. But those thoughts don't haunt me anymore. They remind me that survival isn't just about enduring what's done to you. It's about choosing who you become afterward. I chose to become someone my grandfather would have been proud of. Someone my younger self would look at and say, "You made it. You're okay." That's the thing about forgiveness. It's not an erasure. It's not forgetting. It's choosing to live anyway, to move forward anyway, to love anyway. And that is enough. The sky was overcast the morning I returned to visit my grandfather's grave. There was something fitting about the gray clouds, the gentle breeze stirring the leaves. It felt quiet, still, like the world itself was pausing for just a moment. I parked the car, walked the familiar path lined with worn headstones, and found him. Harold Callahan. beloved father, veteran, the man who saved me before I even knew I needed saving. I stood there for a long time. I didn't speak at first, didn't know how. How do you thank someone for giving you the only love that ever felt unconditional? How do you put into words the weight of everything that's happened since the last time you stood by their side? Eventually, I crouched down, my fingers brushing over his name carved in stone, and I whispered softly, "They tried, Grandpa. They tried to take everything, but they couldn't, because you taught me who I am, and I never forgot." I placed a single white rose by the headstone, a small token, but one that held everything I couldn't say. The memories flooded in the afternoons on his porch, the way he taught me to tie my boots, the way his eyes always softened when he looked at me, as if he saw the person I could be long before I saw her myself. He's the reason I made it. Through the battles overseas, through the battles at home, through the betrayal, the heartbreak, the loneliness. There are wounds that never really heal. But dignity. Dignity is something no one can ever take from you. I stood brushing the grass from my knees, and for the first time in years, I felt light. Not because the pain was gone, it wasn't, but because I'd finally stopped letting it define me. I didn't hate my family anymore. I didn't love them either. I let them be what they were, a chapter, not the whole story. In the months after the court case, life took on a new rhythm. I used the inheritance not for myself, but for others. The Callahan Veterans Scholarship Fund was born quietly without fanfare, just the way Grandpa would have wanted. The first check went out to the daughter of a retired Marine, someone who'd nearly dropped out of college because her family couldn't afford the tuition. I met her once briefly. Her eyes reminded me of who I used to be, full of fight, full of hope. And that was enough. The final scene I'll leave you with isn't me in a courtroom. It isn't me in uniform. It's me standing at the unveiling of a simple bronze plaque. Callahan Veterans Scholarship, in memory of Harold Callahan. For those who serve, for those who stand. And I know deep down that's the real legacy. Not the pain, not the betrayal, not the courtroom battles or the broken promises. The legacy is resilience. It's choosing to build instead of destroy. To forgive without forgetting. To rise without stepping on the backs of others. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or maybe it's a late night where stories like this keep you company when the rest of the world feels asleep? Let me know in the comments. We read every single one. With gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you love or helped you find a little more strength to keep going, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of something more. A community that still believes in kindness, in healing, in second chances. Thank you. Thank you for giving me a piece of your time today. Thank you for letting me share this journey with you. Wherever you are, whatever you're carrying, I hope you remember. Sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. Sometimes it waits, quietly, patiently, until you're ready to open your heart and let it in. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.